and again, apologies for being cut off last time. I imagine that some of you perhaps were tuned in to when I went 20 minutes into my presentation before the accident. And some of you perhaps at this juncture are new to this session. I'm not going to repeat exactly the first 20 minutes that I did last time, but for the benefit of those who weren't there, let me at least cover some of the aspects, because they're necessary to understand the human dynamics, what takes place within, not just from a psychological vantage point, but for the purpose of our session, from a Jewish spiritual vantage point. And it's very, very interesting to see the intersect between contemporary psychology, especially the school of positive psychology that Martin Seligman originated, and the Oxford University has taken it up as its primary base today, and Hasidic teachings of the nature of personality. And we'll find an amazing concurrence in many respects, which we shouldn't be surprised by, because if reality is reality, no matter how you come at it, you must get the same answers. So what I was suggesting last time was that you and I are innately creatures of conflict. We are constantly in a state of inattention. Now, I'm not yet using the word stress. I'm talking about inattention. We constantly find forks in the road that we need to make decisions about. There may be trivial decisions. What will I have for dinner or not have for dinner? Or there may be major decisions in terms of whether I should choose to move home. Or they may be, what I want to focus on, decisions of how I prefer my state of being to be, my mental posture, my emotions. Now, I know that many people have a sense that these are fixed. There's no way I can change my disposition. I was born that way. These are my genetics, and there's no possibility of me altering the genes in my body. And what I was indicating in my beginnings of the last presentation is that that is simply not true. It is not true that you are a fixture and therefore like a machine that's rolled out with a predestined future, and there's nothing you can do in between other than to be yourself, whatever that means. What our genetic predisposition is all about is it gives us certain aptitudes. So, for example, if I were to employ the Hasidic model drawn from Kabbalah as to the 4 human personality natures, I would be coining the following 4: fire, air, earth, and water. And you say, oh, yes, I remember reading about those in some other traditions. And the Chinese even have added on metal and wood. I'm going to stick with the original 4. You are either a fire person, an earth, an air, or water person. Now, of course, you're all 4. But what do I mean? And I'm not going to go through a scholarly discourse on this. You can know this intuitively. What does a fire person look like? How does a fire person behave? You can imagine a fire person is fiery, meaning emotions flow quickly. They rise quickly. They're expressed in a very emotive fashion. If I were to ask you, well, what's an earth person? An earth person, you'll probably say, is someone who is sedate, someone who is grounded. But it might be someone who is lazy, someone who is predisposed to depressive tendencies, or someone who can be relied on because they are solid. Likewise with fire, you can end up being a fiery individual who is angry, flies into a rage, or you can be a fiery individual and transform that into compassion in a very strong way that motivates you to alleviate the plight of others, if not those closest to you. In other words, our genetic predisposition gives us our innate flow of the soul through the body, which I'll explain in a moment. But it doesn't tell us how you choose to express it. You can choose to express fire as rage and anger and cower people into submission, or you can choose to use that fiery nature for the good of society and the good of people around you. That's where choice lies. So don't for one moment believe that you are a prisoner of your innate self. God has given us bechira chafshis. Why do I belabor this point? Because in our current times of stress, COVID-19 has not gone away. And God forbid there should be a second wave. And God forbid we shouldn't be able to cope. It seems like we've got on top of the health coping mechanism, at least in our country, in Australia we have, and I think to some extent in America that's true also, but that doesn't mean it's gone away, and it doesn't mean you're not at risk. And now we have the added stress of social unrest and injustice in society, and how do we correct it, etc. And how do street protests stop being hijacked by special interest groups who are only there to preach anarchy in the streets? In other words, how do we handle ourselves, our interpretation of that? Therein lies a choice. You can either be confident about the future or choose to be totally insecure about the future. You have a choice. And I want to explain in the session how you can actually train to make a better choice and using meditative techniques as a way of achieving that. Let me just go back to one of the things I said, which is very important for us to understand. And let me work backwards. We are a ball of consciousness, a ball of energy flows that make up ultimately who we are in that moment. And those energies coagulate into our body, and our soul flowing through the body creates the moment of consciousness. In my last session, I explained it as follows. I said, we have a piece of machinery called an ear, but that's only a piece of machinery. In order for the ear to function, it requires an energy flow to flow through it. We call that energy flow the neshama, loosely translated as soul. When the neshama, when the energy flows through to our physiology of the ear, the human consciousness experience is called hearing. When this energy flow of the neshama flows through a piece of physiological machinery called the eye, the result is the human consciousness experience called seeing. When it flows through a very complex piece of machinery, but nevertheless still a biological piece of machinery called brain, the result is the consciousness experience of mind or intellect or intelligence or thought, etc. In other words, consciousness is the product of our neshama flowing through the body. But I have a choice of steering it. I have a choice on how I want to interpret it. I observe street riots. My automatic response mechanism is one of fear and insecurity, meaning, what if it happens to me? What if I'm caught up in it? What happens to my shop? What if it upsets my business? What if it comes to my home? These may be far-fetched for some, but not for others. But nevertheless, what is our consciousness doing? Our consciousness is being trapped by a choice to believe that tomorrow is going to be worse than today. Is that a valid conclusion? No. You know why it's not a valid conclusion? Because you're not a prophet. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. There's a 50-50 statistical probability that tomorrow will be better or tomorrow will be worse. And since you aren't a prophet, well, if you are, my apologies, but since most of us are not prophets, how do we conclude? So I'm going to suggest to you in this session and train you to conclude the positive rather than negative. And you'll say to me, hold on, but you said it's a 50-50 chance. So why aren't I rational in choosing the negative? Maybe that's realistic. Realistic to me is another word that's often used for the word pessimistic. You know, you want to sort of put it up in nice, positive terminology, but it's still pessimism. And I'm going to tell you now why it's better to be optimistic than pessimistic. Number one, we know full well that people who are negatively disposed have a close correlation to illness and ill health of the body. Clear. People who are negatively oriented have a statistical correlation with illness, especially angry people. The correlation between anger, person who is habitually angry, and the hurt that takes place in the body is very real. Mind, body. And that's obvious. If the brain is the seat of all our chemical, neurological, and other processes of the body, of which there are billions happening in one split second, it means that if my mind disposition is negative, it's going to alter the chemistry of my body in that moment. Adversely, statistics show. So that's the first rationale why I'm telling you, tracht gut und wird sein gut. Think positive and the outcome will be positive, at least at this point in terms of health, I'm suggesting. Secondly, a very interesting piece of research came out of Harvard University last year. And it said as follows. It was a research on happiness. It said the singular most important factor in order to experience happiness in our lives is relationships, quality of relationships. That was head and shoulders ahead of any other factor. When you are a positive individual, you attract relationships. People like to be around positively disposed people. People don't like to be around pessimists and negative people. So thereby, if you choose the positivity to interpret tomorrow to be better than today, you will, as a consequence of that disposition, have enriched relationships, which will lead to states of happiness. So I have just given you two very telling reasons why you should be looking at the cup half full rather than half empty. That even though it's 50-50 statistical probability that tomorrow's going to be better or worse than today, choose better for those two reasons alone, health and relationships. Now the basic question, how do I do that? Can I train myself to do that? One of the unfortunate aspects is that we are creatures of habit, and not just habit of human behavioral expression, but habit of mind, habit of our thought processes, habitual thinking. Let me explain it as follows, which I mentioned in passing last time. We know full well that for a thought to exist, there has to be a neurotransmittic flow from one nerve end fiber in the brain to another nerve end fiber in the brain. And that pathway is a thought. We now recognize that by being able to see on screen the dynamics of the mind, to some extent at least. And by seeing on screen the dynamics of the mind, we're able to make certain correlations. And we know a thought is when there's a spark and a pathway. Now I'm being awfully simplistic here. Of course, it's much more complex, but the basic proposition is true. Now, as you think that thought more and more, you cut a deeper groove, metaphorically speaking, in the mind. So it's more likely and more easy for that thought to repeat itself. And therefore, if you keep thinking negative thoughts, it's going to be much more likely that you'll keep on thinking negative thoughts. The groove gets deeper and deeper. So how do we undo that? How do I begin to be able to interpret that tomorrow will be better? How do I change myself to be an optimist rather than a pessimist? How can I tracht gut? How can I think positive? Positive psychology even. And the short answer is that why I can manage to transform and change that is because I can undo that pathway. How? By creating another pathway and tread along that new highway more often than the old one. Let the old one seed over. Let the old one have grass growing over it. And in so doing, it becomes disused because a new pathway has been established and you follow it. Now, how do I do that? How do I create in my brain and in my mind a new pathway? And the short answer is by practicing that new thought, especially meditatively. And I'm going to explain what meditation is in our tradition and what it is currently in the world as such. So I've begun to explain a little bit about the dynamics physiologically. I've made the proposition that you have free choice on how to interpret the circumstance of the moment. And I have also indicated the preference to be an optimistic rather than a pessimistic individual. And there is absence of enough data to prove one way or the other because we're not prophets. So that's a summary of where we've got up to at this particular moment. Now, when I talk about soul flowing through the body, it sounds like a religious concept. But the truth of the matter is, there must be an energy flow called a life flow that animates the person. Who are we? We know that life doesn't begin in the body parts. We know that life doesn't begin with the cells. These are inanimate. Something is animating these things. And of course, to scientists, that's a mystery. Science knows its limits. Science knows when to stop. And science knows that beyond a certain axiomatic proposition, it comes belief. Scientists don't go there. Beliefs are not the purview of scientists. Scientists measure existing data. So no one can tell you scientifically what lies behind life force. No one. No one has proven that there's some magical thing called life that flows through the body. I mean, what happens when you die? God forbid. You should live to 120. Imagine 5 seconds after you die, your ear physiologically is fully intact. It hasn't in any way decomposed in 5 seconds. And yet you can't hear. And you'll say, of course, you're dead. What does that mean? You're dead. That's just a descriptive statement of the person's inability to function. Death means that although the machinery is fully intact, something is missing. Even though the cellular chemical function is there. That's why the ear is still a physical ear. It's got shape, it's got form. There is still a van der Waals forces between the molecules maintaining that format of the ear, but it's not hearing. Consciousness is missing. Consciousness requires something more. Call that more energy, call that more soul. Doesn't matter. That's not the purview of scientists. Scientists will simply say something is missing, or the brain has stopped functioning, the heart stopped functioning, respiration stopped functioning, definition of death. Finished. So what I'm explaining here is that there is a higher self that we can call into play to direct the flow of consciousness. Why? Because that energy source, the neshama, the soul, has 5 levels. It's got the level of, from the bottom up, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. And the higher levels are able to determine the outcome of the lower levels. And that's summarized in the following word: I have free choice. I can control and determine the outcomes of the way I choose to see the world, choose to see the world, choice. Wasn't that exactly what Viktor Frankl was proposing in his wonderful short text, Man's Search for Meaning? Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, 4 years in Auschwitz and elsewhere, says they can have imprisoned my body, but they can't have imprisoned my mind. I can choose my attitudinal response. What does it mean when a person was entering the gas chambers and in that very moment chose to say the words, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? What does that mean? It means that they could have gone down crying and yelling injustice or fear or whatsoever. They had the freedom to choose how they died. That's the point that Viktor Frankl is making. We constantly have choice. There's a higher part of self that is able to impact and determine how I will direct the flow from one nerve end fiber to another nerve end fiber through the neurotransmitting highway, and I will choose that highway and not this highway. Okay, now let me talk about meditation and practice of meditation with you. What is meditation? If you were to consult the resident guru called Professor Google and ask him, what is meditation? Our encyclopedic Google will tell you there are hundreds of different definitions, hundreds of different modalities, and by the end of 1 hour of purview of Professor Google's data, you'll be thoroughly confused, and rightly so, because the word meditation is just a word. There is no right or wrong way to meditate. It's like anything else we do. The eyes see, the ears hear, the mind interprets. Meditation is to be able to focus on something in order to have a goal of some kind. The common denominator behind all meditation techniques is focusing. But why you focus, how you focus, that is a matter of what are the goals and philosophy of either the spiritual pathway or the psychological intent or medicinal physiological change, whatever might be the goals. And therefore, since there are hundreds of different possible goals, ranging from spiritual to physiological, therefore, there are many different meditations. But we do have to be careful as Jewish people. Not all meditations out there are actually compatible with us. In fact, the way that you and I usually interpret the word meditation is through an Eastern lens. In the 60s and 70s, some very enterprising Eastern gurus made their way across to the West, and they introduced formats of Eastern meditation. And it became dominant and popular, and therefore you and I tend to view the word meditation through Eastern eyes. But there are Jewish formats and other formats and many other formats. Now, there may not be anything negative about Eastern formats. In fact, there's some good redeeming virtues. However, a lot of the Eastern meditations have elements that we call avodah zorah, literally translated idol worship. What it means is there are elements in Hindu-based Indian meditations that are hurtful to the Jewish soul. And you'll ask me, hold on, what do you mean by Jewish soul? So I want to tell you that our literature, our Torah, informs us that there are 71 different soul systems in the creation of the world. One of these 71 is Jewish, and there's another 70, and each one has its particular function and purpose in life. If we Jewish people don't carry out our Jewish expression of the neshama, the world is missing out. Likewise, if each grouping doesn't contribute its soul personality into the world is missing out. However, idol worship, avodah zorah, is actually spiritually hurtful to the Jewish soul. So I'm just making this cautionary statement so that you know that you have to be discriminating when you do actually search out Professor Google's encyclopedia as such. Okay, so meditation is focusing. Why we focus, what we focus is intention driven. So let me now give you two primary goals of Jewish meditation today, as opposed to yesteryear. If you were to read Aryeh Kaplan's book on Jewish meditation, which is a very, very fine historical overview of minority group meditations in small Jewish groupings in history, excellent historical stuff. But I would caution you definitely not to practice any of those meditations. They can actually be hurtful to you for all sorts of reasons. But I'm not going to actually go into those details right now. We've been advised that there are two primary goals to focus through meditation. One, for health and wellness, and two, for insight. Let me take the second one first. Insight meditation, which is a term that's used out there, but I'm using it in a specific Jewish sense, is called hisboinenus. From the Hebrew, lehitbonen, the modern pronunciation, and the hitbonen is the reflexive grammar form of the root binah. Binah, you will no doubt know, means understanding, lehavin. And when you do the reflexive form of the verb, lehitbonen, it means to allow understanding to flow through you. And a particular methodology which we use in Chabad extensively for this purpose, it goes something like this. Before prayer, before davening, we would sit down, we do, and study a piece of wisdom teachings of one of the masters, one of the Rebbes. And we might spend half an hour studying it. But at the end of that study period, you would take one strand of the inner wisdom and you would focus on it meditatively, internalizing that wisdom, so that in the course of the day, in the course of your life, that wisdom is firmly implanted in your inner self, so it becomes expressed in your daily activity. You grow as a person. So hisboinenus means to create an enlightened state by taking a wisdom and allowing it to become alloyed with you. You and it become one. And that's a meditative process in order to effect that. That's one. Another one is in terms of health and wellness. Stress. I haven't mentioned stress till now. And yet that's the most common response mechanism to the kind of lives that you and I are currently going through. So what we're talking here about stress is, and let me add, not something that you cause. Sorry, I'll say that again. It's not something that the world causes to you. The world does not cause you stress. There are no stressors out there that stress you. And you'll say, hold on, we're having full of stressors out there in the streets and in the air. No, stress is how you interpret it. Stress is how you choose to understand the threat and to what extent you internalize it. You can choose to take it greater in some lighter grain, or you can choose to be totally frozen by it and unable to sleep. Stress is what you cause yourself, and how you choose to interpret. Free choice interpretation. I've said it before. How you choose to interpret, that is something that you have freedom to do. So the second meditative exercise is how to create a state of being that you don't stress yourself. And that is very much related to having a sense of faith and security. And that'll be my second part of my meditation today. So I'm going to take you through two meditative exercises. I'm going to let one flow into the other. And what I'm going to do is firstly put you into a state of inner balance by removing you from negative dispositions that are taking place, by removing you from negative interpretation, by taking you into a completely different focus. And in so doing, you'll be ready for the next stage of the meditation, which will be the ability to be able to create around you a sense of safety. The first one's going to involve focusing on breath. Why? The Hebrew word for breath is neshima, which you will readily understand has a relationship to the Hebrew word neshama, soul. Breath and soul are very closely related. In fact, breath is the first level of expression of the soul. By the way you breathe, one can interpret the way that the soul is flowing through the body. There's a very interesting Chumash in Shemos, the second book of the Chumash, where you might recall the incident where an old man with a long beard comes in out of the desert into the land of Mitzrayim, Egypt, and he opens his mouth and says to all his brethren there, brothers, sisters, we're leaving. We're going to the promised land. And do you remember how they responded? They said, leave us alone, old man. We've got tasks to complete. Our taskmasters have given us a quota. We haven't got time to listen to your mishugasim. And Rashi comments there that they responded in this way, mikoitzer ruach, from shortness of breath. In other words, when we are stressed, when we stress ourselves, breathing is quick and shallow, koitzer ruach. I'm going to take you through a breathing exercise which does exactly the opposite. Not short, but long breaths, not shallow, but deep breaths, and what we call abdominal breathing to create the deep breathing. And then I'll take you to the second part. Okay, let's adopt a posture. Just symmetry, wherever you might be, whether you are seated in a chair or otherwise, feet symmetrically next to each other, hands resting on knees or thighs, back fairly straight, head well balanced on the shoulders, and gently close your eyes. And just focus on your breath, gently breathing in and gently breathing out quite normally. And if you can, I would ask you to breathe in and out through your nose. Slow down and deepen your in-breath and out-breath through your nose. And become aware of the difference in temperature between the air entering the nostrils compared to the temperature of the air leaving the nostrils. Just become aware that the in-breath is cooler air and the out-breath is warmer air. And just stay focused with nasal breathing, registering the cooler air entering and the warmer air exiting. And just stay focused on that temperature differential, experiencing cool, warm, as you breathe in and breathe out. Slow down and deepen your breathing even more, And with your next in-breath, direct the air down to your abdomen, expanding your abdomen to collect the air, and then contract the abdomen to expel the air. So breathing in through the nose, expanding the abdomen and directing the air down there to the bottom, to the stomach area, and then pulling your tummy in to force the air out again. The trick is to expand your abdomen as you breathe in. This is a little counterintuitive, so practice it for a few breaths. As you breathe in through your nose, expand the abdomen straight away, collecting the air there and breathing it out. Take 2 or 3 abdominal breaths. Slow and deep, expanding your abdomen as you breathe in. And now let's lend some rhythm to the breathing. We'll breathe in for a count of 3, hold for a count of 3, and breathe out for a count of 4. Take a slow, deep breath in, 2, 3, hold, 2, 3, out, 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, hold, 2, 3, out, 2, 3, 4. And just continue breathing slowly, deeply, abdominally, rhythmically, gracefully, smoothly, a perfectly round circle. And just become aware at the back of your mind how relaxed you have become in the space of a few short minutes, removed totally from any thoughts of stress or negative thoughts, in a nice neutral zone now. Let me segue to the second exercise. I want you to conjure up a glow of light in the center of your head. A source of light in the middle of your head that glows, creating warmth, pleasantness, enlightenment in your mind and head. Feel that glow inside your head. Intensify the glow so that the light begins to flow down your neck into your chest cavity, glowing more warmly, pleasantly, warmth and light in your chest as well as your head. It's comfortable, it's pleasant. Intensify the glow in your head even more, and thereby allow the glow to flow into your limbs, arms, wrists, hands, fingers, intensifying the glow further, flowing now into your thighs, legs, feet, toes. Your whole body is a pleasant glow, feeling its warmth, feeling its light, and it begins to radiate into your skin, so that your skin all over begins to feel a glow. And now, radiating from your skin all around you, creating an aura of warm, pleasant light, an aura of light surrounding you. We call this aura Magen Avraham, Abraham's shield. You have created a security shield all around you, a spiritual shield emanating from the power of Abraham that you have now formed around you, creating safety, security, a sense of comfort. Visualize that aura around you and extend it, expand it so that it begins to surround all those in your home. Connecting now to the mezuzah in your home, providing security for your whole household. Your aura, providing security, protection, safety. Allow it to extend into the world, allowing your spiritual aura to leave a footprint in the sands of time, impacting the world, making the world a better place, something you individually can contribute to in this way. In order to effect the security of your aura, of your Magen Avraham, you have to be aware of it. You activate it through mindfulness, through awareness, through consciousness, that you have the ability to create a protective shield around you. Your awareness activates that protection. And just experience the wonderful aura of Magen Avraham all around you, within you, beginning with the soul source in your head. Focus again on your breathing through your nose. Become aware of the difference in temperature of the air entering the nasal passages compared to the temperature of the air leaving the nose. Begin moving your fingers and your toes, wherever you might be. Move your fingers, move your toes, and when you're ready, gently open your eyes, coming all the way back into the room, back with me. What did we do then? We began by focusing on our breath in such a way that it removed our pathway of consciousness from negativities. We began to lay down a new circuit of the brain, a new pathway. But like with everything, unless you practice it, you don't actually create a new groove of a new pathway. Everything requires practice. Say you wanted to learn to play the piano. So you decided, well, I live now in the 21st century. I'm not going to do it in the old-fashioned way. I'm going to learn piano in a modern approach. I'm going to spend a year studying the theory of music. I'm going to study the different great composers, Chopin, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, Brahms, you name it. I'm going to look at their biographies. I am going to see what turned them on. I'm going to study the mathematics of notation. Why are notes different and sound different? I'm going to be able to read the notes. I'm going to be able to study the different tonal qualities of different instruments. And in the space of a year, you study all that and you succeed. And then you say at the end of the year, right, now I'm ready. You sit down behind the keyboard of the piano and you say, fingers, do your stuff. And guess what? The fingers don't do their stuff. And you ask yourself, hold on, I've just spent a year learning how to know music. Why don't the extremities of my body, fingers, why don't they know to play the music? And you'll say, it's obvious. It's not so obvious. What part of you knows? Does only your head know? Does your body know? Do you know? Who are the you? But you decide, yeah, there must be something in the old-fashioned approach. And you decide, yeah, I'm going to practice the scales. I'm going to repeat them, even be bored by them. And guess what? The fingers suddenly learn to play the way that you know. Why? Because in the first instance, you didn't lay down a circuit in the brain that connected the knowing to the fingers. In the second scenario, by practicing the scales, you did lay down that circuit. Likewise with meditation. If you want to create inner balance, removal from previous patterns of thinking, you need to practice a focusing technique like we did with breathing. And that requires playing the scales, repeating it, morning, afternoon, evening, 3 times a day, I recommend. And although we spent some 10, 15 minutes on it today, after a while, you can reduce it down to 1 or 2 minutes. I assure you, achieving everything we did in 15 minutes in 1 or 2 minutes, but only with practice. And in a second exercise, what did we do? We created a visualization of protection. And by having that sense of surety around you, which I assure you is real, but visualizing it creates its reality for you as well, you will respond to the stressors of the world in a very, very different way. And in time, through practice, you'll be able to become a positively disposed person rather than a negatively disposed person. Far less stressed, far healthier, and with many more positive relationships. Well, that's what I wanted to share with you on this occasion, but I'm sure that perhaps there are questions which you may want to pose to me and you may want to actually discuss, and I'm very happy to learn from you. So feel free at this point. My very, very dear nephew, Rabbi Menashe, feel free to open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Laibl, very, very much. And on behalf of everyone here, I think I'm watching everyone's reactions, responses after the meditation. We feel better already. I have some questions that were messaged me privately. Someone asked, what if you have difficulty visualizing light and they haven't been able to do it in 18 years?
We have different aptitudes. Some people are good on visualization, some people are not. There are a whole variety of different exercises, some which I teach and share, and I'm happy to share them with the individual. Alternative mechanisms of focusing other than visualization, which will at the same time achieve the same goal. I actually put up on the chat my email address. If you go through the chat to the beginning, you'll see my email address, and anyone who wants to pose any questions to me that way or get any materials, I actually produce meditations, short 60-second meditations for 3 times a week. Anyone who wants those, please feel free to email. They're on a WhatsApp, so include your phone number so we can WhatsApp it to you, or anything else, feel free. So yes, if you have difficulty with visualization, I understand that, and that's not the only way to do it.
One more question coming in here. The light which we were visualizing, what would you say that is in actuality?
The word light and the phenomenon of light is a wonderful metaphor that Kabbalists use, because the property of light is so flexible. Light gives of itself. Light creates the power of vision. Light has the ability to transfer into the subtle segue of enlightenment. So it's used as a metaphor extensively. What we were talking here was using the metaphor of light to create an aura, which was really a physiological explanation of what is a spiritual phenomenon that we are constantly radiating from our soul into the world. And if we're able to harness that and utilize that appropriately, you can utilize it as a defense mechanism and the creation of an aura around you, which you really have all the time. But by becoming aware of it, it starts to change the way that you view the world in a much more enlightened manner.
Thank you. And a question here in the comments. You mentioned about reading some masters. Who can you recommend?
I personally have basically focused on few, and they have been the Lubavitcher Rebbeim, and especially our Lubavitcher Rebbe that was concurrent in our lives. I think that one of the unfortunate tendencies of modern person, because there's so much available in Google land, internet world, to grab from, we've become very, very eclectic to the point of shallowness, that we don't spend time with one particular teacher, but we say, well, this year, what's new? And it must be that wisdom has to be constantly invented. And that's simply not the case. Human beings have not changed from the word go, from the moment that Adam was created. We have not changed our nature. No, there was no such thing as cavemen and we evolved and there was no Darwinian evolution and what have you. And I know I'm raising issues that you'd love to debate with me now and there'll be no time for it. But still, when Cain murdered Abel, Cain murdered Hevel and wiped out 1/4 of the world's population of the time. We've been doing that ever since, except we become more efficient in that regard. We can kill more people more quickly than ever before. But we can love more people more quickly than ever before. We can send out and radiate through our personal example the capacity to create change in the world much for the better. I'm wanting to go back to the question though. In other words, I believe that when one learns from even one master in a whole lifetime, but does that deeply, then you gain immensely. I have chosen the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Do I recommend other people? I read beyond the Rebbe's writings. I read a lot of writings of other people as well. But when it comes to throwing myself into emulation and doing and practicing, I've chosen the Rebbe as my master. And I think you could do a lot worse.
Question here, do you have to have quiet to meditate?
Initially, it's certainly easier. Most people just don't know how to be able to focus their mind when there are constant things grabbing at it from the outside, noises and the like. So for most people, quiet assists. But of course, when you become proficient at it, and that varies from person to person in terms of timeline, it doesn't matter what's going on. I can put myself, my family, and I have an extended family living with me right now. I've got my daughter and her family of 4 children living with us at this moment while they're out of their own home for while it's being fixed. And there's noise all over the place. And they remark, how can you sit there and focus while all this yelling's going on, especially our 1-year-old? And I have no problems, but that's not the beginning. That's later on in the piece. So yes, quiet is a big advantage initially.
Thank you. Why do you not recommend Arya Kaplan's techniques of meditation?
Well, for example, let's take one that he borrows from Abraham Abulafia, who was a medieval meditational Jewish teacher, a rabbi of renown. One of his techniques was to take your head and place it between your knees and focus between your knees on certain letters of God's name in an extended manner. For whatever reasons, meditationally and Kabbalistically, these are chosen. I'm not going to go into that. But I assure you that if you were to spend time bent over with your head between your knees in that manner, it's very likely that you will become unconscious in no time whatsoever. The blood rushing in the wrong direction. And therefore, what I'm simply saying is that sometimes taking someone's descriptions of formative and esoteric approaches without the proper learning, preparation, and study and practice can actually be dangerous. And because he doesn't pretend that he's writing something for every one of us to practice, he doesn't say that in the slightest. He's just writing a very wonderful work describing some of the esoteric practices of the past. No, I don't recommend them. I don't see the goal orientation in our age for most of them. And secondly, because we're not studying them, and just to adopt it willy-nilly by oneself is very, very likely to lead to a bit of trouble.
One last question posted here in the comments. What do you think about Vipassana meditation?
About what? Sorry, didn't catch that.
Vipassana meditation.
Vipassana meditation. Yeah, Vipassana meditation is a very well-known approach in the East, and it's translated as insight meditation. It's not exactly the same as you and I describe insight meditation of hisbonenus. In fact, there is actually quite a differential between them. And technique-wise, it's very good. Content-wise, there are some things which we would have as Jewish people problems with. So again, it's not an issue of adopting different schools of meditation. It's a matter of being knowledgeable enough to pick out the eyes of various approaches which are useful and good and be able to adapt them for oneself as needed. But I don't in any way think that any novice who has just a smattering of meditation up their sleeve from going to a few classes with different people, having that capacity to make those choices. Therefore, I always advise you, consult somebody else first.
Do you ever use sound in your meditation?
Yes, often. Sound is a very good focus. The use of a chant is very good. Chanting the Shema with the right emphasis on the right words and syllables is a very powerful focus to provide understanding of the inner meaning of, for example, echad, unity and oneness of the whole totality of existence, or being able to focus on the sound of the word Shema and understand that it's conveying a sense of insight, learning, not just hearing, but listening so it permeates you. There are many ways of using sound, and even innocent sound of a musical note, etc., as a focusing technique. But sound is not an end in itself. There's no virtue in just being able to focus on a sound so that you're focused. There must be a goal. There must be a purpose. I want sound to get me to reach somewhere in order that I can carry out my goal, which broadly speaking is always wisdom intake.
Okay. Avram Avinu studied many disciplines, including the practice of the East. Can
Yes.
you elaborate on what constitutes Avodah Zarah and what to make of Avram Avinu's gifts and life in this context?
I wrote a book called Practical Kabbalah, which Random House very kindly published for me, and you can get it on Amazon. And in it, I have a whole chapter on Abraham and the gifts that he provided through his sons, which ultimately became a lot of the Eastern postures and orientations. And I explain there how they derive from Abraham Avinu himself, both in terms of concept and idea, and the mechanics of how they became adopted and then defined in ways as time went on, which were quite different and sometimes contrary to Abrahamic teachings as such. So I'm not going to go through all that. But I do want to make it clear that it is important that when you speak in terms of ways of filling your mind, be it by taking a course, be it by listening to a teacher, be it by meditating and putting information in your head, you're playing with your head, you're playing with your mind. And it's very, very important to have good advice from a master, whoever that might be, at least a rabbinical authority to be able to check out what is Avodah Zarah. So in answer to your first question, what is Avodah Zarah? It basically means that you attribute divine powers to either an object or a force other than God. It's almost as if your reliance in life shifts away from Hashem to some other elemental aspect. And then there may be certain rituals surrounding that, and they may be an aspect of the worshiping process. But basically it means moving away your focus from God as the center and attributing to some other source the powers of godliness, sometimes in opposition to God itself. That's giving you just a very brief overview of what Avodah Zarah is. Today,